Now page number 62. Number 7. Shakespeare the artist. Shakespeare is an artist hardly needs asserting in the present day. It is true that his art was probably far less self-conscious than that of Milton or of Tennyson, that it was probably more intuitive than aforethought. The distinction, however, is probably not so important as it seems. A great artist does not need rules or conscious analysis to tell him what is good and what is evil. Any analysis that may be necessary may be done subconsciously. As an artist, Shakespeare is concerned about almost wholly with the artistic worth of humanity. He is never preoccupied with that beauty of nature which haunts so insistently the minds of modern poets. He uses it sometimes with the hand of a master, but his thought is centered on humanity and he passes on. He rarely takes pains to emphasize the picturesque aspect of things, even of the situations he himself creates. He creates the picturesque and leaves it without comment. The mysterious beauty of that watch on the battlements of the castle of Elsinore, the cold, the silence, the hushed voices, not a mouse stirring, save for that portentous figure, the prologue to the omen coming on. All this is left to speak for itself. What Shakespeare loves as an artist is power intensity in human character. It may be power of intellect or moral power, or power of passion or grace, or the intensity of the exquisite as in Ariel, or power of love as in Imogen, or power of wit as in Benedict, or intensity of stupidity as in Sir Andrew Aguecheek, whose silliness approaches the sublime, but it is always the intense, the perfect in some kind that he dwells upon and makes central. Splendid and puissant personalities are the primary material of his tragedies, giants of wit or silliness of his comedy. If we put aside the morbid, there is only one form of the extreme in human character which he never makes use of, and that is the extremely brutal. The merely bestial he disregards entirely, yet his characters, splendid or extreme as they are never extravagant or abnormal in their nature. They are rather perfected types of the normal. We may fairly say that Shakespeare sought for the highest expressions of the normal in humanity, but mere mediocrities Shakespeare makes a little use of. He relegates them to the background and uses them as foils and explanatory notes. Mediocrity may be complex, but Shakespeare has not the modern love of the complex as such, though he masters it when he pleases. But he prefers a complexity that is not commonplace, like that of Hamlet. Mediocrity may be tragic or pathetic, but Shakespeare prefers the pathos of Imogen and the tragedy of Lear. The man who is dull, but not dull enough to be altogether laughable, the man whose summed virtues make up respectability, whose actions are reducible to fear, who can neither dare nor enjoy freely, is not a subject of Shakespeare's art. He is included but passed over. Number 8. Blemishes of Shakespeare's art. The defects and blemishes in Shakespeare's work are many and obvious. They are more obvious than important, and yet perhaps they are not generally sufficiently insisted upon in the present day. There is a strong tendency in us to ignore or pass lightly over the faults of a body of work which we have learnt to love and revere and take pride in. The unnatural side attitude is that of the Earl of Lord St. Vincent towards the irregular genius of the greatest seaman. But you must not criticize him. There can only be one Nelson. It can hardly be denied that Shakespeare's plays abound in word jugglery and jesting that is often trivial and sometimes sadly out of place, in rhetorical flights which impede or weaken their actions and are psychologically false, in inartistically long-winded narrative or description, and is far-fetched and sometimes confusing imagery. In the early plays especially he uses trivial quips and quibbles, sometimes at the most inopportune moments, and from his habit of playing with words and importunate jesting he never entirely freed himself from. In later plays he heaps up a confusion of unilluminating metaphor to the point of obscurity, and is sometimes guilty of that inexcusable abuse of language which consists in trying to make words do more than can be done with them. In the historical plays he is consistently over rhetorical. His love of descriptive narrative, of dignified rhetoric, and his desire to work out his thoughtfully partially blind him to the essential. The speeches tend to be too long, too diffuse, and too formal. The same fault is markedly apparent in his later plays. Nor can it be denied that Shakespeare's plots are very seriously faulty. They are carelessly handled and full of incongruities. End of page 62, now page 63. Shakespeare shows a disregard for plausibility which at times is so great as to suggest a lack of sense in it. He displays a readiness to make use of preposterous devices in order to hinge a plot or to bring about a catastrophe. The disguise of the Duke and the substitution of Mariana for Isabella, on which the plot of Measure for Measure turns, are childish devices worthy of the Arabian Nights and utterly incongruous with the tone of the play. The Merchant of Venice is built upon suppositions such as Gilbert and Sullivan might have adorned. The Winter's Tale begins like a tragedy and ends like a fairy tale. In this case, it is not merely a matter of crude construction, but of confusion of idea. Even in the greatest tragedies, the construction is far from perfect. The catastrophe of King Lear is forced and hurried. There is no sufficient reason for the suicide of Goneril. The ending of Hamlet is brought about by the clumsy device of an excessively unlikely exchange of weapons. Few, in fact, of Shakespeare's plays are entirely plausible, and some of them are afflicted with gross absurdities. Nor can it be pleaded that Shakespeare borrowed his plots and was therefore not responsible for their imperfections. Number 9. Poetic way of using words. The special characteristic of Shakespeare's poetic way of using words, according to Dr. Dashes, is a combination of precision and suggestiveness, of sharp definition and rich implication. As Rees observes, Shakespeare was master of bright Apollo's lute. Note the quiet music in the words of Antipholus of Syracuse to Luciana in the Comedy of Errors. O train me not, sweet mermaid, with thy note, to drown me in my sister's flood of tears. Sing, siren, for thyself, and I will dote. After this light music, let us listen to Macbeth's grimly bewitching music. Present fears are less than horrible imaginings. My thought, whose murder yet is but fantastical, shakes so my single state of man that function is smothered in surmise, and nothing is but what is not. Here next is the music of the spheres, coming from the desperate soul of Othello, who is about to put out the light of Desdemona's room, also the light of her life, and also the light of her life. Put out the light, and then put out the light. If I quench thee, thou flaming minister, I can again thy former light restore. Should I repent me, but once put out thine, thou cunning pattern of excelling nature, I know not where is that Promethean heat that can thy light relume. Shakespeare's word music not only delights but imparts practical wisdom. Shakespeare does not, of course, formally don the mantle of philosopher and preach to us or propound a philosophy of his own. Yet from his writings the careful reader may incidentally derive moral instruction and spiritual elevation. Shakespeare exercises our moral interest and perceptions, though he does not ostensibly expound matters of behavior or bend fiction to the support of principle and precept. Number 10. Shakespeare's style. It is found that among the English writers, Shakespeare used the largest number of words, nearly 21,000. The Shakespeare concordances and dictionaries help us to appreciate this wealth and also that the divergent meanings that words had in his time. Shakespeare did not believe in eating paper and drinking ink, but his English is far removed from contemporary English because words had different meanings then. A character speaks of a humorous night in Romeo and Juliet, where humorous does not mean a night on which a romantic comedy is staged, but a damp night. Similarly, it is nipping an eager air. The word eager means sharp and refers to the cold wind on a wintry night. Shakespeare's language is not well understood even in the public schools in the United Kingdom today. A public school student is said to have written in an examination script, "Shakespeare was a polite gentleman. He said 'go to,' but never completed his sentence." Abbott and other grammarians have written interestingly on the grammar of Elizabethan English, the shift of the parts of speech, the nonce words, and so on. Careful studies have been made of Shakespeare's style. It has been shown by Middleton Murray and others how words like honest and royal can be regarded as keys to the play in which they figure. Othello, Antony, and Cleopatra. All the important characters speak in their own individual idiom. Hamlet has the habit of repeating a word 3 times, and Claudius indulges in rhetoric in order to conceal his insincerity. End of page number 63. Now page number 64. But the defects of Shakespeare's style have also attracted attention. Shakespeare's rhetoric and bombast and his mixed metaphors, as in taking arms against the sea of troubles, have been pleasantly glanced at. Dr. Johnson had already pointed out to this reader how a quibble of pun influenced Shakespeare like fatal Cleopatra. More significant work has been done on Shakespeare's symbolism and imagery. Wilson Knight, Middleton Murray, Miss Purgeon, and Clement have made remarkable contributions in this field. Wilson Knight showed how each play could be viewed as an extended metaphor, and how in both the tragedies and the romances the three figures of the villain, the hero and the heroine as redeemer are found. Even celebrated characters like Falstaff, Hamlet or Prospero are as symbolic as they are individual and typical in the play in which they figure, but too exclusive a concentration or imagery and symbolism leads to a fermentation of Shakespeare's plays. It is better to study them comprehensively in all their aspects rather than isolate their imagery and try to see the whole in part, as it were. Shakespeare's use of prose and verse and the transition from one to the other have been carefully studied. Even the characteristics of the blank verse of Shakespeare as handled by him at different times in his career have been fixed, and the proportion of end stopped lines to run on lines has been used to determine the chronology of plays, but a detailed metrical analysis of at least the great passages in Shakespeare does not seem to have claimed the attention of critics as yet. A line like "blow winds and crack your cheeks," rage, blow, it is dramatic as it is lyrical. Characteristics of Shakespeare's work. Taken as a whole, Shakespeare's plays constitute the greatest single body of work which any writer has contributed to our literature. Perhaps their most salient feature is their astonishing variety. Other men have surpassed him at this point and that, but no other has ever rivaled him in the range and versatility of his powers. He was, though not equally at home in tragedy and comedy, and his genius took in innumerable aspects of both. He was supreme, not only as a dramatist but also as a poet, whom the worlds of high imagination and delicate fancy were alike open. And while not himself a very profound or very original thinker, he possessed in a superlative degree the faculty of digesting thought into phraseology so memorable and so final that, as we all know, he is the most often quoted of all our writers. He was also entirely free from dogmatism of any kind, and his tolerance was comprehensive as his outlook. In the vitality of his characterization, in particular, he is unparalleled. No one else has created so many men and women whom we accept and treat not as figments of the poet's brain, but as absolutely and completely alive. His unique command over the resources of language must also be noted. His vocabulary is computed to run to 1500 words, and while that of Milton contains scarcely more than half that number. The greatness of Shakespeare's work is apt to blind critics to his limitation and defects, but these must of course be recognized in any estimate of him, or otherwise we shall get him out of his proper focus. Broad as he was essentially a man of his time, and while his plays were remarkable for their general truth to what is permanent in human nature, still his interpretation of human life matter is that of an age in many respects very different from our own. He wrote hurriedly, and signs of hasty and ill-considered production are often apparent. Designing his plays expressly for the stage, and anxious to secure their success under the actual condition of stage representation. He was willing at times to sacrifice consistency of character and the final theatrical effect in his occasional coarseness. He reflects the low taste the groundlings to whom he had to appeal. At places his psychology is hopelessly crude and unconvincing. His style is vicious, his wit forced and poor, his tragic language bombastic. These and other faults will be conspicuous to anyone who reads him in the least critically. But they are small things after all in comparison with those paramount qualities which have given him the first place among the world's dramatists. Conclusion. God of our idolatry. In 1840, Carlyle already visualized the end of Britain's Indian Empire. But of Shakespeare, he said, "This Shakespeare does not go. He lasts forever with us." End of page 64, now page 65. We cannot give up our Shakespeare. This King Shakespeare does not he shine in crowned sovereignty over us all as the noblest, gentlest, yet strongest of rallying signs? Britain as a political force had to quit India in 1947, but Shakespeare is with us still here in India, for we too cannot give up our Shakespeare. Speaking not only for any particular linguistic region alone, but for all India, isn't Shakespeare a god of our idolatry? 2. Making a third with Valmiki and Vyasa. No writer, ancient or modern, can be for the people what Valmiki and Vyasa are to Indian humanity. Yet, simply as a poet and a creator, Shakespeare must rank with Homer and with Valmiki and Vyasa. It is not a question of the intellectual grasp alone. Bernard Shaw thought that he was a far greater thinker than Shakespeare, and so perhaps Ben Jonson thought. Strictly as mystical and philosophical poets, Dante and Sri Aurobindo look massive by the side of Shakespeare, while Goethe's intellect seems a phenomenon apart and unique. The Mahabharata is gravely encyclopedic, comprehending as it does all the worlds, all life, and all thought, but on his own chosen ground of poetic drama, Shakespeare outdoes everybody else, and even simply as poet and creator, a few equal him and none excel him. Sri Aurobindo once half flippantly arranged the world's greatest poets in 3 rows. First row Valmiki, Homer, Shakespeare. Second row Achilles, Virgil, Kalidasa, Dante, Milton. Third row Goethe. Shakespeare has thus no peer in English literature and not many equals in world literature. Of the great figures of the Renaissance age, Shakespeare was among the greatest, and George Brandes hails him as one of the supreme trio with Michelangelo, who died when Shakespeare was born, and Cervantes, who died within a few days of Shakespeare's death. And if Shakespeare was Michelangelo's peer in pathos, he was equally Cervantes in humor. Coleridge has called him the morning star, the guide and the pioneer of true philosophy, but Shakespeare is more truly the quintessential and complete poet, in whose works we see the recording of the heartbeats of the entire human race. Shakespeare's world is a world of every man. His art is the ensouling of the image of men's littleness and greatness, grovelling and scaldings, defeats and triumphs. We exchange pulses with these other men, these men, women and children, and we journey back and forth like Shakespeare's own Pericles, alternately buoyed up by hope or daunted by failure, till at last the Pisgah vision of possibility is for a second vouchsafed to us, and even the music of the spheres is heard to echo evermore in our ears. As it has been said of the Ramayana of Valmiki, of Shakespeare too, we might say that not for another 400 years alone, but for as long as the hills stand and the rivers flow, for as long as civilized mankind survives on earth, so long will the darlings of Shakespeare's imagination mingle in global humanity's business and bosoms, exercising the mind, setting the heart ablaze, and attuning the still center of the soul to the affable rhythms of existence. Other dramatists of Shakespeare's age. Of the crowd of lesser playwrights whose work extends from the time of Shakespeare's prime to the close of the period, I will name only a few who may be said to occupy the foremost positions in the second rank. John Webster, 1580 to 1625, was a dramatist of sombre cast, of genius and great power, though his morbid love of the violent and the horrible led him too often into sheer sensationalism. His White Devil and Duchess of Malfi contain scenes of tragic passion unrivaled outside Shakespeare. In John Ford, 1586 to 1639, a similar tendency towards repulsive subjects and unnatural emotions is apparent, but his pathos gives a distinction to his best work, like The Broken Heart. The names of Francis Beaumont and John Fletcher are always associated, and they did much work in collaboration, though Fletcher continued to write with great fluency for the time 9 years between his partner's death and his own. Their moral tone is often relaxing, their sentiments strained, and their characterization poor, but they have many redeeming features, and such plays as Philaster and the Maid's Tragedy successfully challenge comparison with anything in the romantic drama outside Shakespeare. Philip Massinger, Massinger, a ready writer in various styles, reached a high level in his comedy. A New Way to Pay Old Debts, James Shirley, belongs to the reign of Charles I. But we may mention him here as in Charles Lamb's phrase, the last of a great race. End of page number 65, now page number 66. In all these writers, and still more in smaller men whom we need not pause to name, the decline of the drama is apparent. By the time we reach the end of the period, we find that all the old creative power has gone, and that the stage has yielded completely to the fast-spreading immorality of the age, while even the formlessness of the blank verse employed gives one more sign of general decay. The Elizabethan age has well been called a young age. It was full of boundless vigor, reawakened intellectual earnestness and unfettered ভুল হয়েছে আবার পড়ছি The Elizabethan age has well been called a young age. It was full of boundless vigor, reawakened intellectual earnestness, and unfettered, soaring imagination. The best fruits of the age are enshrined in poetry, in which all these elements can be befittingly contained. In poetry, there are restrictions of versification which exerted some check on the youthful imagination and the vigor of the Elizabethans. Consequently, Elizabethan poetry is very great, but prose does not admit of any restrictions, and the result is that Elizabethan prose is as one run amok. Too much of liberty has taken away much of its merit. During the 15th century, Latin was the medium of expression, and almost all the important prose works were written in that language. It was in the 16th century, particularly in its later half, that the English language came to its own. With the arrival of cheap mass printing, English prose became the popular medium for works aiming both at amusement and instruction. The books which date from this period cover many departments of learning. We have the chronicles of such writers as Stowe, Stowe, and Holinshed, recapturing the history of England, though mixed with the legends and myths. Writers like Harrison and Stubbs took upon themselves the task of describing England not of the past but of their own age. Many writers, most of them anonymous, wrote accounts of their voyages which had carried them to many hitherto unknown lands in and across the western seas. Then there are so many novelists who translated Italian stories and wrote stories of their own after the Italian models. There are also quite a few writers who wrote on religion. And last of all, there is a host of Pump who dealt with issues of contemporary interest. Though the prose used by these numerous writers is not exactly similar, yet we come across a basic characteristic common to the works of all, that is, the nearness of their prose to poetry. The age, says G. H. Mayer, was intoxicated with language. It went mad of a mere delight in words. Its writers were using a new tongue for English and was enriched beyond all recognition with borrowings from the ancient authors, and like all artists who become possessed of a new medium, they used it to excess. The early Elizabethans' use of the new prose was like the use some educated Indians make of English. It was rich, gaudy, and overflowing, though in the main correct. A.C. Ward observes in Illustrated History of English Literature, Volume 1, our modern view of prose is strictly and perhaps too narrowly practical and utilitarian or functional. Prose, we hold, has a job to do and should do it without fuss, nonsense, or nonsense, or aesthetic capers. It should say what it has to say in the shortest and most time-saving manner and there finish. But we find Elizabethan prose far from this commonly accepted principle. It is colorful, blazing, rhythmic, indirect, prolix, and convoluted. Rarely does an Elizabethan prose writer call a spade a spade. The prose works of the Elizabethan age fall into two categories. One is fiction and the second is non-fiction. Let us consider them one by one.